Welcome to the UCLA Policy Lab's discussion on understanding homelessness. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of the Division of Social Sciences at UCLA. Thank you for joining us today to learn about the impressive work of the California Policy Lab on an issue that is of particular importance across California. Today, you will hear about efforts to address the homelessness crisis, as well as potential measures that could be enacted to prevent individuals from becoming homeless in the first place. Our motto in the social sciences is engaging LA, changing the world. And important discussions like this deepen our understanding of critical social issues that affect our community and beyond. A special thanks to Dr. Felicia AdamsKellum, Janey Rountree, and Craig Turk for bringing their expertise and perspectives to today's conversation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Craig Turk, who will moderate today's discussion.
Dean Hunt, thank you so much for hosting this event. Homelessness is, as we all know, so clearly one of the most critical issues we're facing right now. And I know everyone here is grateful to UCLA and to the California Policy Lab for making this discussion possible. My name is Craig Turk, and I'm a member of the California Policy Lab Advisory Board. And that is, I have to say, a commitment I'm very proud to have made, because the issues on which CPL focuses, homelessness, poverty, criminal justice reform, education inequality, they're not only fundamental, they could not be more timely. I was born in California, and I'm raising my family in Los Angeles, and I see every day how much work we have to do and the need to do that work quickly. Professionally, I've had the opportunity both to research and to write about public policy ideas, as well as to consume and try to implement them. And my experience has been events like these can be incredibly valuable when they focus on not just identifying, but also untangling the most important underlying causes of an issue. And when they can be very specific about what approaches seem to be working, while also offering data-driven evidence as to why. And the key, of course, is choosing the panelists. And today we have two absolutely excellent ones. Both are experts in this field and critically have deep and varied experience looking at the problem of homelessness and working on it. We are very pleased to have Janey Rountree, the founding executive director of the California Policy Lab at UCLA. In addition to leading CPL, Janey is a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council and deputy director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. Prior to joining CPL, she was Mayor Rahm Emanuel's deputy chief of staff for public safety. And in addition to having direct oversight of the Chicago Police Fire Department and Office of Emergency Management, Janey did critical work on violence prevention that included developing policies involving homelessness. Prior to working in the Chicago mayor's office, she was senior counsel for New York City's Mayor Michael Bloomberg. She has practiced law, she's taught high school, and worked in the nonprofit sector. And Janey holds a BA from Williams College and a JD LLM from Duke Law School. So Janey, welcome. We're also very, very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Felicia AdamsKellum, who is the president and CEO of St. Joseph Center. Dr. Kellum joined St. Joseph Center in 2008 as president and CEO. And under her leadership, St. Joseph Center has tripled its staff, expanded its services, and broadened its geographic reach, becoming a recognized leader in homeless services throughout Los Angeles County. Dr. AdamsKellum holds a gubernatorial appointment to the California Department of Housing and Community Development's No Place Like Home Program Advisory Committee. She's also served on and continues to support the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority Ad Hoc Committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, as well as the National Alliance to End Homelessness's Race Equity Network. She currently sits on the Housing California Board, Policy Lab Advisory Board, and the Board of Trustees for Mount St. Mary's University. Born and raised in Southern California, Dr. AdamsKellum graduated with a BA from the University of Southern California, earned an MA from Ball State University, and completed her PhD in counseling psychology at Stanford University. So Dr. AdamsKellum, welcome to you as well. We are thrilled to have both of you here today for what we know will be a terrific discussion. And before we really get into the substance, Janie, can you tell us a little bit about the California Policy Lab and the kind of work you do?
I would love to do that. And Craig, first of all, thank you for being here to host and moderate the event. It's a real pleasure to have a conversation with two people I respect so much. And thanks to everyone who's listening today and engaging on this important topic. As Craig mentioned, I spent many years working in executive positions in the government. And I can say that those positions are privileged, but they're very stressful. You're trying to solve entrenched social problems, many of which have existed for decades, if not hundreds of years. And you're doing it often in crisis mode where you have to make decisions quickly. And I will say that the number one challenge is accessing data and evidence to inform the decisions that you're making. I found myself very hungry for information that I felt like I could rely on to make really important decisions. Often, I think academic researchers can fulfill that role, but it's very hard to access their thinking. They might be writing or producing work on different topics that aren't related to the crises that you're facing. But I always believed in the power of data and evidence, and that's really why we started the California Policy Lab. And I moved here to Los Angeles about 4 years ago. We have 2 sites, one at UCLA and one at UC Berkeley. And to put it in perspective, the state of California spends the equivalent of Mark Zuckerberg's net worth every 5 months, and estimated less than 1% of social spending is informed by data and research, right? So the stakes are really high. The government will always be the most important place where solutions and spending happen on behalf of very vulnerable people. And our mission is really just to improve the lives of Californians by generating research that transforms that public policy. And we do it by pairing researchers at our universities to public agency leadership to develop collaborative research agendas. And most importantly, to bring in data to try to improve the rigor of the evidence, to link the data, to analyze it, and then to translate the findings. Because you can do a lot of work to do really rigorous research, and if no one understands what you're saying or why it applies to policy decisions, then you haven't really had the impact that we think we can have. We work across 6 issue areas: health, criminal justice reform, poverty, education, labor and employment, and homelessness. And that's very intentional, because when you have a human-centered approach to research, you cannot afford to work in a silo. You cannot afford to only think about criminal justice policies or only think about unsheltered homelessness, because these institutions and policies weave together to impact people's lives. And so for our part, we're linking that data and we're understanding how these systems interact with each other. So I think I just wanted to say, one note at the top, which is that I'm pretty sure we have some of our funders in the audience today, and they are really essential to what we do and how we do it, more importantly. So not just enabling the California Policy Lab to work directly with public agencies to create research agendas, but they give us the flexibility to respond by letting us decouple our work from large research grants. So especially in the last year during the pandemic, having the flexibility to pivot and say, okay, the world is changing and we need to move at a different pace or tackle different questions. The funding that we get that allows us that flexibility is crucial. So I just wanted to say thanks to Arnold Ventures, the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, the Haynes Foundation, Smith Richardson, the University of California Office of the President, and others who give us that kind of general operating support. So thanks for letting me fit that in at the top.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's incredible work that I've gotten to see firsthand from CPL. Felicia, can you tell us about the work that St. Joseph Center did, which I've also started to become familiar with, and is so important and so interesting?
Thank you so much. And Janie, I appreciate you inviting me to participate on the panel today. Craig, so good to meet you. St. Joseph Center has been serving low-income and homeless individuals for over 40 years. And the bulk of our services up to about 6 years ago were on the West Side. We've since expanded to offices in South LA and also in downtown Los Angeles, really close to Skid Row. We serve about 10,000 people annually across 4 main pillars of service: outreach and engagement, housing, mental health, and education and vocational training. And so if you kind of get a sense of what those pillars mean, it means for outreach and engagement, we're really dealing with the most critical, immediate needs of the most vulnerable members of society, where there are people who are living on the streets and unsheltered, or families who are suffering from food insufficiency. We serve about 500 people a week at our food pantry. The need went up by 70 to 80% at the peak of the pandemic. So we were needing to respond very quickly. We have a sit-down cafe for the homeless. So we turned that into grab and go meals. We also started to deliver to homebound seniors who were at risk of contracting COVID. And one other thing that just is so important is that we really provide wraparound services. So not only are we meeting people in their immediate need of crisis, we see people becoming, we see them evolving, and we want to empower our participants in every way possible. And that's why the education and vocational training work that we do in partnership with SNAP, with our coding program, and the many restaurants that employ our students in culinary, and the Hilton Foundation's recent expansion to our coding program is just so exciting. So we really want to always uplift people and give them an opportunity to earn a better living and stabilize in housing. So that's St. Joseph Center.
It's fantastic. It's it really is. And you know, as we're talking about this, I think one of the things that a lot of people who had RSVP'd for the webinar had commented on, to me, is the real desire to have sort of a full and frank discussion about this issue, because homelessness is obviously, it's this massive humanitarian crisis that we're facing. But I think there's this sense shared by a lot of people who are participating in the webinar that it's worse in California, and specifically in Los Angeles, than almost anywhere else in the nation. And so I'd like to open up by asking, Janie, we'll start with you. Is that true? How did we get here? Can you start to put this into sort of a broader historical context for us?
Absolutely. So fundamentally, it is true. Homelessness is categorically worse, I think, on the West Coast, and in particularly in California, in 2 ways. One, just the size of the population of people experiencing homelessness, and also the number of those people who are unsheltered. And I thought I would just start with some very basic facts to ground our understanding of the size of the problem, and then talk a little bit about the historical underpinnings of how we got here. So as you might be familiar, every year, with the exception of this year during the pandemic, we conduct a point in time count. So volunteers literally go out and count the homeless population living on the street and in shelters. And then there's a survey done to learn more about those people's experiences and conditions. And the most recent year, there's an estimated 66,000 individuals on the street at that point in time. It's usually conducted in January. But homelessness is not a static condition. And so the population is constantly changing and people's situations are changing. So when we look at the data available to us from the county, we see at least 140,000 unique individuals experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles in any given year, if you start to look at it over the course of a year. And that's probably an underestimate, because we think there are many people who are not captured in that type of administrative data. So it's a staggering problem. As I mentioned, it's largely unsheltered. So 75% of the homeless population here in Los Angeles is unsheltered, meaning they're not in an emergency shelter or other type of temporary or permanent housing. They're on the street. One question that I get frequently is, are these people from California? Are they coming here to take advantage of services or whether? And the answer is largely no. And that's supported by research after research after research project. Homeless people are generally homeless in their community. They don't have the means to travel far or the inclination to do so. At least 82% of the survey respondents report that they're homeless very near, where they grew up or were working, and that's supported by research that we did to link homeless services records to state employment records. So that's a pretty rigorous source of information, and the vast majority, 75% of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles over a 10-year period were wage earners in California. And so these are people who are members of our community. I want to acknowledge that if you're listening in from the Venice area in particular, it's a little bit different there. We do see slightly different mix on the west side, and particularly in the Venice area, where there are a slightly higher percentage of people coming to that community, but largely in LA County, they're from California. And I think the bottom line historically is that this is a problem about a severe housing shortage and stagnating income. It's really that simple. 50 years ago in California, as a state, we made a decision to stop building housing to keep pace with our population growth. And that decision, was written into a number of policies, one of which preferred single-family housing, zoning policies that prefer single-family housing, a number of different regulations around how housing is built, the need for parking, other types of regulations that were layered into these decisions. And over the years, the sum conclusion is that there is a severe housing shortage in California. So, and that's particularly true, obviously, for affordable housing. So, estimated gap of 517,000 units for people who need housing who are earning less than 50% of area median income or lower. So that's just an indicator of having a lower income in your family. That's an enormous gap. And the governor has set policies or goals to try to build affordable housing, but when you look at the number of units that the administration has said should be the target, there isn't enough land in California zoned for that use to build it as quickly as we need it, right? So we really have to understand that we're unwrapping layers upon layers of policies that have created a housing environment where there's a shortage. The other side of that equation is income. So as housing prices in our region increase, income is really stagnating. So to put that in more concrete numbers, between 2000 and 2017, so over a 17-year period, rents increased by 32% and average income decreased by 3%. So these housing costs that are skyrocketing are happening at a time where wages are not increasing. There was a really fascinating study put out by Zillow that uses data collected on the Zillow platform that estimated the point at which in your community you can expect to see a large visible homeless population. And basically, if on average your community is spending more than 32% of income on rent, so within any family, if you're spending more than 32% of your income on rent, at a community level, you can expect to see a homeless problem. In LA, we're at 50% on average that we're spending on housing costs. And so this is a math problem. And I think it's really important to understand that, because the long-term solutions are housing and income. And we have to keep that in mind as we're talking about what to do. Of course, we need to provide supports and strategies for unsheltered homelessness, and we need to have a robust homeless services sector that's serving the people who are currently homeless. But if we're going to get ourselves out of this situation, we really need to be thinking at a much larger scale around housing policy and income supports. The last thing that I want to say about that is that, and I think we'll spend some time talking about this topic, but this is fundamentally everything I just said is an issue of race. And it's really important to understand that all of the policies that I mentioned were either intentionally or unintentionally designed to exclude communities of color, and in particular, Black communities in California. So everything from access to mortgages, access to land and housing opportunities that are near job centers or on transportation lines, exclusion from the workforce, these things have been going on at the same time and have led us to a situation where being Black is a risk factor for homelessness because of the structural racism that's in our housing policies, our labor policies, and also things like criminal justice system and over incarceration. And so in Los Angeles, the Black population is about 9% of the county's population, and it's about a third of our homeless population. So I wanted to make sure that we talk about that and acknowledge that head on.
Yeah, absolutely, and we will, because as you say, it's on one level a math problem, but it's a math problem that's greatly complicated by generations and generations of laws and regulations that have made it very hard for that problem to be solved in any sort of efficient way. And Felicia, I wonder if you can help put that into some additional perspective and maybe open up or build on what Janie was talking about in terms of the critical role that race plays in the problem of homelessness.
Well, absolutely. And what's so interesting is I'm listening to Janie. I'm so appreciative of the work that she is doing. And honestly, when I got into this work, I just wanted to help. I just wanted to end homelessness. I wanted to help people who are facing food insecurity. But it is really important that we understand that homelessness and poverty don't happen in a vacuum, and that there are systems that make it very difficult to end homelessness. And as Janie said, there's been some, baked in policies that have made it particularly difficult for people of color, for Black people in particular, to stabilize themselves in housing, to have adequate wealth that is passed on generation after generation, that keeps them stably housed. And when something really bad happens, that they're able to weather the storm. And so we do see that these policies have affected California significantly, and LA County in particular, and that when we see this overrepresentation of Black people, it isn't because there's something inherently going on with Black folks that we don't want to be housed or we don't want to work. It is, in fact, systemic racism from slavery, Jim Crow, and as Janie mentioned, redlining and mass incarceration that have contributed to this overrepresentation. According to the Supporting Partnerships for an Anti-Racist Community report, which came out in 2018, they're really noting that one of the things that would make a real difference in our sector is, one, acknowledging the overrepresentation of people of color among the homeless, and that we might begin to have our staff be more reflective of the people we're serving, because race does sadly matter and factor in to why so many people of color are struggling. And in that report, they kind of outline about 5 main domains of work and factors that contribute to why race matters and factors into homelessness. And one of them is the economic mobility, sort of this lack of economic capital within a family system. And they note this vulnerability and fractured systems that contribute to families not being able to have the resources to help each other out. So that fragility, that vulnerability means that when the rents go up, who does one turn to if everyone in my family is struggling? And that housing vulnerability is also really a factor, the lack of adequate, safe, and affordable housing, and the policies that contributed to communities not having adequate, affordable housing is truly a part of what impacts Black people and the increased homelessness. The criminal justice system also plays a factor, and particularly if Black people have been involved in the criminal justice system and have received a felony. So that can create ongoing challenges, we know. Behavioral health and the lack of adequate investment in behavioral health centers is important, and that it is not always the kind of work that is culturally tailored and informed around racial trauma and the experiences of Black people in this country. Family stabilization, multi-generational poverty, engagement with the Department of Children and Family Services and Welfare, 50% of kids coming out of care at risk of falling into homelessness. So you see those feeder systems as well coming out of mainstreams that really do affect Black people and their experience of homelessness.
And I know, Felicia, you were part of the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, which issued a pretty groundbreaking report. Can you give people just a sort of a sense of maybe an executive summary of the report?
Absolutely. Well, it was really out of the 2017 point in time results that showed that while Black people make up 9% of the general population, Black people made up 40% of those who are homeless. And you couldn't even explain that, not at the local or national level, by poverty rates, which at the United States sort of level, it's about 25% of those in deep poverty are Black, and yet 40% of those who are homeless, and those numbers are reflective here in LA. So we know that poverty doesn't explain the overrepresentation of Black people. So there must be something else going on. And so we were called together and formed a great group of people, which was formed by the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. And in 2018, we released our results, and it really came out of connecting with people who are both still homeless service providers. We met with a whole host of folks who are engaged in the sector to really identify about 67 recommendations. And they were cross-cutting from the cost of living in LA, as Janie pointed out, the lack of employment opportunities, permanent housing and retention issues. And one of the things that really came out was a feeling that, I don't see myself, some of the folks reported, in who is serving. And I really need someone who cares. So that sense of care, that sense of generosity, that sense of empathy needs to really be shown through. And then also the sense that maybe our programs are not always as culturally tailored or sensitive as they need to be. And some of the work that Janie is doing and the Policy Lab is doing around, the coordinated entry system and the questions around, are we truly measuring Black vulnerability in a way that targets those who are most at risk of becoming homeless or who are homeless and in need of services. So we want to make sure that we're using systems that are truly sensitive to that overrepresentation. And the other piece that we found is that we really have to call out systemic racism. For so many years, what we said was, anybody can become homeless, and it could happen to your mom or your dad. And what we know from the results and the statistics is that it actually is more likely, sadly, for it to be my brother or my cousin than your brother or cousin. And that isn't right. And that is absolutely reflective of what we're seeing in the injustices in our country and the systemic issues that have put us in the situation that we're in. The Color of Law is a great book that outlines the results of redlining in our country and the fact that the wealth disparities that we see, and so many families rely on their home as their wealth building mechanism. And if Black people were kept out of that, as Janie mentioned, then you're going to see generations and generations of people renting and not having opportunity to own, which means they're reliant upon their landlords for what their budget's going to be. And that is something we must factor in. And when we look at solutions, that has to be addressed.
Right. Janie, CPL provided some of the statistical analysis for the Black people experiencing a homeless report. So building on Felicia is talking about, what do you see the role as for homelessness researchers going forward when it comes to addressing racism?
That's a great question. So we did provide data analysis for the ad hoc committee, and that's actually how I met Felicia. I'm so glad that I met her several years ago through that project. But one of the key findings that we found, we were asked to look at, are different racial and ethnic groups able to access services in Los Angeles in ways that are equitable? So it's a pretty specific question. And one of the things that we found is that while different racial or ethnic groups are able to access permanent supportive housing, which is a very core intervention for homelessness, many homeless people need housing, and they need supportive housing with a case manager or other supportive services. In Los Angeles, different racial or ethnic groups are able to access that resource, but we saw Black clients returning to homelessness at higher rates, particularly Black clients who are single adults and not part of families. And so we, the report that Felicia mentioned had a number of calls for action to the research community, and one of which is, let's try to understand what's happening here. So the California Policy Lab put together a research team. And for a question like this, we felt strongly that it needed an interdisciplinary research team. So it was led by Dr. Norita Milburn, who is at the Department of Psychiatry here at UCLA. We had graduate students from sociology in the Department of Education, and they were supported by quantitative analysts at the California Policy Lab. So we really put together a mixed methods or interdisciplinary team. And we first looked at the data for guideposts, really, what's happening here? Are we really seeing disparities in returns when we stress test the data? Short answer is yes, they were there for single adults. But if you work with administrative data, you know that it in a case like this, it doesn't tell you the whole story. It's telling you what's happening. It doesn't tell you why. And so the larger research team did interviews with clients, case managers, and we focused on providers in Los Angeles where we were seeing large disparities and where we weren't, right? So we really wanted to try to figure out, get stories, individual stories about what's happening here. And the findings were fascinating. There are too many of them to go through all of them today, but to hit the highlights, one key finding is that we tend to think of permanent supportive housing as the same everywhere. We tend to think of it as an intervention, but for clients who live in these units are very different. You could have permanent supportive housing placement that's standalone, that where you have a lot of independence and control over your lease and your life, or you might be in a unit where there's a lot of restrictions on your mobility. And it turns out that on average, Black clients are being put into that second category more often. So they don't see this as permanent housing, whatever label we put on it, they don't see it that way. They see it as a stepping stone to another type of outcome. Another important finding is that Black clients are more frequently placed into housing that feels unsafe, where either at the community or in the housing itself, they have pretty serious safety concerns. There is racism occurring, in the placement of clients. So landlords saying, or case managers even saying, we're going to put our Black clients in these types of housing for whatever reason, right? And then I think, one finding, and Felicia and I have talked about this, is that there are structural issues with our community-based service infrastructure. So if I could take a step back for a second, when the federal government or the state government in particular wants to solve homelessness, they want to fund housing units if they're going to fund anything, right? They want to fund the subsidy or they want to fund the unit. But it's much harder to get funding for the services that make all of these client experiences and success possible, right? So organizations like St. Joseph Center, but there are many others, there are dozens operating here in Los Angeles. And they are community-based organizations, and we rely on them and their staff for the success of these programs. How do you get clients into them, and how do you retain clients in their housing? And one of the things I think we see happening, particularly with Black clients, is that the community-based organizations that are serving them are also underfunded, and they are also impacted by structural racism in terms of the ability to fundraise or to access grants or to have the infrastructure that makes you eligible for grants. And also just supporting key positions, career positions. So case managers are critically important for a client's success, but it's not a professional career. You don't advance into senior roles, right? So really thinking about some of these structural issues, it may sound in the weeds, but these things really matter if we're going to solve racial disparities. We need to make sure that people have access to services, that the organizations serving them are prepared to do that in ways that are successful and meaningful. The last thing I'll say that I think is really important, and that because this is a talk hosted by the Social Science Division at UCLA, I think it's an important thing to say, but the ad hoc committee report not only called on researchers to examine topics, but they called us out for the way we do our research. And that's really important. When you're working, when your goal is to have community impact, you need to understand how your research affects communities and how the way you do it affects your results and affects communities. And so we've been thinking a lot at the California Policy Lab about how we bring different perspectives to our work, when we include people with lived expertise, when we're designing research questions, when we're interpreting data, how we talk about data, the terms that we use for different racial or ethnic categories. And we have a process at California Policy Lab across all of our policy areas to think about these issues and the methods for looking at racial disparities, how we talk about it, how we have more community participation in the research process. But specifically on homelessness, the project that I talked about is a good example of where we really diverged from our normal way of doing business. We're statisticians and economists, right? And we're used to sitting with data, putting the results out, but we have to be much more intentional about how those questions are framed and then how the results are given back to the community. So in the project that I described, we've had somewhere between 6 and 8 community meetings to present the results and get feedback before we finalize the paper. So that's a very different approach than I think we would have taken 2 years ago, without the push from the ad hoc committee and other input into how we do our jobs as social scientists and economists. So I'm really grateful for that. And I think it's had a pretty big impact on the way we do the work.
Which is obviously critical, since race is obviously so important and such a deeply complicating factor, right, as we wade into this. And on top of that, now there's another newer issue, which has obviously complicated our response to the homelessness crisis, and that's the pandemic. Felicia, I have heard you speak about, in really moving terms, about our shared communal instinct. And, many people have made the decision to live decidedly less connected lives recently. But what has the past, year plus looked like for people experiencing homelessness? What's the experience been on the people served by St. Joseph Center? And what's it been like for you to operate during such a challenging time?
Well, thank you. Well, we were very aware that there was a crisis of homelessness already well in place before the pandemic hit. I remember being on the phone with my staff in March when we were saying, okay, how are we going to continue to deliver services? Or we're going to be shut down. What's that going to mean? And then we were going through the governor's, order, and we were like, oh, it looks like we're going to be doubling our efforts, actually. We got to send some people out to the field, even though it's going to be potentially deadly. And we immediately saw, even in that time, and we worked really hard to look at equity in our organization. We're 75% people of color when, 7-8 years ago, we were majority white, 60% white. So we've done a lot of work. But even in that, and the way that the careers and educational opportunities, come together, the vast majority of people who were able to just pick up their, computers were people with degrees. And then our staff who maybe didn't have degrees and lived expertise were the ones doing that outreach, or the ones going over to the Project Room Key. And it was very hurtful to see that, wow, these folks that are 3 times as likely to get COVID and 2 times as likely to die are the ones that are essential workers, paid the least oftentimes in our organizations, and keeping us all safe. So we were able to negotiate and ask the LAHSA, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, for hero pay, because we had a lot of heroes. And I actually have one staff member who didn't see her children for 3 months, because she was tasked with opening up the Project Room Key site. And it's just phenomenal. Of course, we've seen that among, the medical professionals in the last year. And so all of that is about, okay, what does our infrastructure look like? We have outreach workers that work throughout the West Side and also in South Los Angeles, and we needed to double those efforts. But the CDC guidelines required that we engage people in encampments and not require them to put their tents down during the day, because that would increase the spread. So we literally had outreach workers going into encampments, first feeding people in encampments, so they weren't having to go and move about to get food. And then it moved to testing, literally going out with medical professionals and testing. And then also now vaccinating people right in encampments. We were also called out to be one of the first to open up a Project Room Key site, which is the repurposing of these underutilized hotels for people who are gravely at risk of contracting COVID. And if they were, they would have to be hospitalized. So that became an overnight situation. So it's like someone called me on Sunday and we opened on Thursday and immediately had 130 very vulnerable people housed. And so the kind of pivot that's had to take place is extraordinary, but I know that everyone's out there listening saying, but it still looks worse than ever. There's more encampments than ever. And I hope you hear me in saying that part of that is because the CDC guidelines required that there was no enforcement and there was no requirement that people take their tents down. So that did increase the amount of encampments. And you mentioned this communal nature, and I think we all have suffered from not being able to be together and not being able to be with our family members and missing holidays. Well, we're all communal, we're all human, and we're all so connected. Well, the homeless are that way as well. Many women are unsheltered and they rely on their encampment mates, the people who are to the right and left of their tents to keep them safe. There's so much domestic violence, rape and sexual assault out there among the homeless from perpetrators. And not that the homeless are perpetrating these, that there are people who harm the homeless is what I mean. And there's so much violence out there. And for women, it is deadly. And so who you camp with, who you are unhoused with, is often the difference between life or death. But what we know is we don't want anyone to remain unhoused. We saw that homelessness is a public health crisis. People who are unsheltered weren't able to shelter in place like many of us, choose to stay home to stay safe. And they were just extraordinarily vulnerable. And it's been an honor to try to keep the positivity rate down. I think we did a pretty good job, but we now are in a deeper hole, it seems, with regard to the encampments and
Right.
what the streets look like today.
Right. Janie, how have the past 15 months impacted your efforts? And maybe you could speak a little bit about what you think the sort of the lasting economic effects of this will be.
Yeah, I think, Felicia's report, from what it feels like at a personal level on the ground, is so crucial. And I'm gonna bring us back out to the 30,000-foot view. And in part, I think I'm gonna talk a little bit about some bad news and then try to end with some good news. But I think it's I keep having this thought in the back of my mind as we move through the different phases of what has been a crisis over the last month. How do we keep people safe? How do we get Project Room Key and Project Home Key rooms set up? And underlying all of this is a massive economic crisis that I don't think we have fully felt yet as a society, and will start to feel over the next 6 to 12 months as our economy reopens and we start to take stock of what's happening. So to put some facts to this, obviously we've had eviction moratoria in place. And so when they are lifted, we're anticipating potentially an increase in evictions. I think people are working very hard to figure out how to prevent that from happening and what are sort of policy and funding levers to prevent that. But the California Policy Lab is the primary research partner to an agency called the Employment Development Department. And in California, that's the agency that manages all of the unemployment insurance claims. So everyone who filed unemployment during the pandemic. And since the pandemic started, our faculty director, Till Van Wachter, and researchers have been taking individual level data and trying to make sense of what's happening in real time. We've been issuing monthly reports. And just to give you a sense, this is an unprecedented employment impact in California. On a scale much larger than the Great Recession. And it's very particular because we're seeing a whole range of low-income jobs disappear or go down. So 45% of workers in California have claimed unemployment insurance since the start of the crisis. It's 9.2 million unique claimants for unemployment insurance in the last year. And it's having a huge impact on workers of color. So the fraction of the pre-pandemic labor force claiming unemployment insurance benefits is close to 90% among Black workers, 73% among Asian workers with no more than a high school degree, and close to 70% among Generation Z workers. So this is having staggering impact on Black workers and young workers in particular, and other minority groups. We have an estimated 814,000 households that are behind on rent. 5%, are behind multiple months. Our work in our safety net and poverty portfolio is also trying to understand the impact of federal policies. So obviously it's hugely encouraging that the Biden administration passed a stimulus package to try to get emergency aid to low-income people. But the mechanism for doing that is automatic payments for tax filers. And so we estimate in California, 2.2 million low-income families and people will be left out of those automatic payments because they're not earning enough income to file their taxes. So in some ways, the most vulnerable people are at high risk for being left out. We have offered policy solutions, the no filer tool, and other types of interventions that can support that. But for those of us who work on homelessness, this is really concerning that the people who are potentially at highest risk of homelessness due to the lowest income might be left out of things like the stimulus package. And so, different researchers have forecasted something like a 40 to 60% potential increase in homelessness due to the economic impacts of the pandemic. I think it's hard to say with any certainty. We just don't know. There are too many different influencing factors, including these policies, to try to mitigate the effects of lifting the eviction moratoria. But as a community, we need to understand this is about to get worse. And I think we need to be in crisis mode again, but on a different mode. It's no longer, at some point, we will move out of the public health crisis, hopefully, related to the pandemic, and we're going to have to switch gears and really think about the economic crisis and how to make ourselves nimble at getting assistance to people quickly, and to understand, for example, how safety net programs are affecting people who are at risk. So I said I would end on a positive note. I think the one thing I will say about the last year, at least from what I've observed, is that we do know we can do this. We know how to house people. When it is the #1 priority and there are resources available, we can move people into motel rooms. We can move people into housing. And I think I give so much credit to all the essential workers and frontline workers who have done this. It's exhausting. People are really tired, but I think, going forward and looking at the solutions, we know we can do it. It's just a matter of having the resources to meet the demand.
And knowing how to channel the resources, right? I mean, this is actually, I'm going to build on the sort of note of positivity, because it's important to acknowledge that, through the work of organizations like CPL and like St. Joseph Center and many, many more, I know a lot of whom are represented in the attendance of this webinar today, we are housing thousands of people in Los Angeles. In spite of that, though, the homeless population continues to grow. And I think critically in response, we're focusing and learning more about the power of prevention in this area. And I would love to Janie to hear a little bit. You started to talk about the work that CPL is doing there, and then Felicia, to hear you talk about the prevention strategies you're seeing as having the greatest success, and maybe to use this as sort of a segue into the issues surrounding mental health among people who aren't home.
So I think everyone wants to know what works, and what are some of the solutions. And certainly preventing more people from becoming homeless before they become homeless is a huge solution. And it's an area that we've been very focused on. And I want to start by saying that we're pretty sure prevention works. And when I say prevention, I mean one-time small amounts of cash assistance, and typically an attachment to a lawyer who can help resolve a legal crisis related to housing or employment, that suite of services works and can stop the trajectory. And we can prevent people who are on the precipice of becoming homeless from becoming homeless, and save them a lot of health and other negative impacts, and obviously reserve resources in the system. So the problem, the challenge is that it's very hard to know who to give that assistance to, because when you're looking at the population of people living in poverty, despite the size of the homeless population, is statistically very rare. So, less than 1% of single adults who are living in poverty are going to actually experience homelessness and be unsheltered. So how do you know who to give that cash assistance to, or how to prioritize that legal assistance? And that's really the research question that we've been focused on. And we've approached it from at least two different angles. I think one is trying to identify current county clients. So these are people seeing the Department of Health Services, for example, or who are clients of the Department of Mental Health. How do we identify among them who's at highest risk of homelessness? Because there's a point of intervention. If we can reach them through mainstream services, prevent their homelessness, then they're not going to end up needing expensive housing interventions. And so to do that, we've been building predictive models using large linked data sets. And we published a paper on that a couple of years ago that actually inspired public funding for a pilot that's underway right now in partnership with the Department of Health Services and the Department of Mental Health. So it's totally new, untried strategy, but this is where we really think innovation is important. We've got to rethink, how we solve these problems. So that's a strategy to reach current county clients. There are obviously people at risk of homelessness that are not county clients. They're not yet connected to public services. And for those people, we're in the middle of trying to empirically validate a screening tool. So if LA heads in the direction, which I think it should, of broadly marketing prevention, like if you think you're at risk of homelessness, call this hotline, make it really simple, one point of entry. If that happens, they're going to need to be able to screen people into the program and understand who should be prioritized. And so we've been in partnership with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority working on validating a screening tool to do that. So, and we hope that work will come out next summer. And we're putting a lot of time and energy in it, knowing the crisis that we're about to face.
That's tremendous. Felicia, what prevention strategies are you seeing on the ground as having the greatest success?
Well, like Janie said, it's important to keep people housed. There's about 600,000 LA County residents that are spending 90% of their income on rent. So they're very vulnerable to falling out of housing if we don't have aid, if even food assistance is critically important. Sometimes the cash aid that Janie mentioned, someone could fall behind, and we know we have a lot of families that have fallen behind on rent. And there's been some rent programs in Santa Monica and LA County that we've been helping out, paying back rents before the moratorium ends so that we can help those families. So keeping people housed is critically important, because once a family falls into homelessness, it is so difficult to get them back into spaces that will help them. So there's that problem solving that a lot of our teams that are working with families are doing to see if there's a family member, if you could give them rent for a while, would they allow you to stay or move in? So what kind of help could you use to keep your job or find a job, and in the interim we pay rent short term? So that's really helpful. The rapid rehousing rental assistance is a way that once people fall out, we can quickly get them back in. And again, once we get them housed, the prevention piece is making sure they're back to work, making sure their kids are stably in school, so that once the tsunami hits again, they don't fall back into homelessness. And one of the other things we do and have done for many years at St. Joseph Center has been payees. So that means we're helping pay the rent and bills of people with severe mental illness. And we have found that to be critically important for people who have, a major disability and could maybe go off their meds. And oftentimes when people go off their meds, then everything falls apart. But as their payees, we continue to work with their landlords, keep those rents up. And we think those are really important areas of work around prevention.
Right, which makes a lot of sense. Can you touch, Lecia, for a moment on mental health issues and trying to most effectively get at those, either vis-a-vis prevention or just generally speaking?
Well, 1 in 5 of the people who are homeless are mentally ill, and some people believe that it's the vast majority. And but what we've told you is that most folks who are unsheltered indicated that it was their first incident of homelessness. It's like 56% of those who are unsheltered, and they tied it to an economic situation. But we do have about 30% of those who are homeless who are suffering with mental illness. And many of those who are chronically homeless are suffering with multiple issues, health and mental health in nature. And what we found is that multidisciplinary teams with someone with a background in psychiatry, a social worker, a nurse, someone with a background in or has a lived experience of homelessness, incarceration, or mental illness can be very effective as we wrap services around those who are mentally ill. We have not invested, we know, enough in treatment programs that allow people who are severely mentally ill to stabilize. And we know 5150s are very challenging, and there's a lot of debate around that. But I will say we need to have those emergency response teams that are not the police, that are skilled to respond to the needs of people who are in a mental health crisis. We have a great team in Venice that is funded by Supervisor Sheila Kuehl that has a particular focus on the severely mentally ill. And we work very closely with the partner FQHC, Venice Housing, and Venice Family Clinic. So those partnerships that help people in the housing area and with the health issues has been really effective in serving those who are severely mentally ill, who need housing, who need mental health services, and need it to be integrated. And I will tell you that once we've helped people with severe mental illness, we keep them housed at a 95 to 97% success rate. And that's because those practitioners continue to visit people in their homes. And then through permanent supportive housing work that we're doing across the county, we are in those spaces preventing people from falling out of housing because we're bringing them their meds, we're keeping them housed. Right. And we're also doing that with people who were previously incarcerated. So the reentry population is getting that kind of mixed work with a background in mental illness and incarceration. So we're keeping them housed as well. And it's been quite effective through the Department of Health Services.
That's fantastic. I am conscious of the time. We have probably a minute or two left. And I know Felicia and Janie, both of you are busy, and I don't want to take too much of your time. I would love to ask one final question, because I know that we had just an absolutely unbelievable response to the webinar today, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are listening, some of whom work in the field and are subject matter experts, many of whom aren't. I think a lot of people who are listening today want to be part of the solution to this problem because they see it and their children see it, and it's something, it's part of our community. How can your average person get involved and help and make a difference?
I'm happy to start, and Felicia, I'm eager to hear your answer to that question. I have a few different ideas. I started the conversation by talking about these state policies that really need to be unraveled. And one thing I would recommend is just pay attention to what's happening in the state legislature and how bills affect or are connected to solutions to homelessness. And when you see one that is a part of the solution, definitely take the effort to let your elected official know and to be involved in advocacy campaigns. The United Way Home for Good team is a great resource for tracking legislation, as is CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing. On a personal level, I think it's really important, if you live in Los Angeles, that you understand who your homeless provider is that's working in your area. They are responsible for geographic territories. So your provider might be different if you live in Hollywood than if you live on the West Side, for example. But just know who they are. Once you know who they are, you'll see them actually when you're out, you'll see their staff, and understanding what their needs are, what a referral process looks like, what they think about the homeless population in their community, There might be ways to participate in ancillary activities like food banking or volunteering, but I find that it's really helpful to have that personal or knowledge about your own community. I think it's really important to have conversations with your friends and family that are well informed. There's a lot of stereotypes or fear about the homeless population, and whether you learn something today or want to further educate yourself, having those conversations are really important, and with your kids too. These are people, and reminding yourself and your family and friends of that, I think is a simple way, I think, to be involved in the problem. And of course, we think that research and data have impact. We were really proud actually last week that we had issued a report about the number of people who fall out of food stamps because of paperwork requirements. And food stamps are a vital resource. And the County of San Diego Board of Supervisors responded to that paper by reducing a paperwork requirement for the CalWorks program and creating a task force to evaluate and reduce paperwork requirements for other safety net benefits. And so I think if you're listening and you have an affinity for data and research, but want to have an impact, I think this is a way to do that. And I think we do have real impact stories where we are not a direct service provider. We're not doing the amazing work that Lecia is doing with people, but when we do have an impact, we can shift a system that influences potentially thousands of vulnerable people. So thanks, Craig. I'll turn it over to Lecia.
Well, that was really well said, Janie. And I'm really glad you asked the question, because we are all in this together, but it doesn't always feel like we're all in this together. And I think we all have to be thinking about, how do I lean into my humanity? My daughter keeps me on my toes, and I'm like, I do this every day. I don't know what more you want me to do. And she's like, keep going, keep going.
Right.
And our kids need us to be human and to keep caring about others. And I'm glad we talked about why we're here, because sometimes people think it's a personal decision that people are homeless, or, they're not working. And so we need to sort of understand that there's a lot that's been baked into the system that's been very unjust. And so you see families and you see individuals out there struggling. And sometimes, a lot of times it's to no fault of their own. So what we know that people can do is be kind, keep educating yourselves. I want to, there's a shout out to the folks that were living around the Penmar Park in Venice. They were so frustrated to just see all the encampment growing and growing, and the issues with the potential fire. But when we went in, we worked with them closely, the neighbors, the community, our unhoused participants who were responsive to us, and there was no police involvement. And those beautiful neighbors who had been struggling for a year, just worried about people dying out there, or fires, or their own families, and all of the trash that was, amassing. But they were kind, they were supportive, they were connecting us to people. They were the ones that, like Janie said, they were educating us about those homeless neighbors that were right there in their community. So please reach out to us. Know that we care. We're working 24/7. Sometimes the communities don't look like there's all these nonprofits out there working day and night, but we are. And many of the people who work for us were previously homeless, and they're struggling. And I think that's another thing. We need to be employing people with lived experience, people who were previously homeless, bringing them into our organizations. I'm committed to hiring people who have been out there living in those encampments, because they know, they get it. So I think that's another thing that we can all do, is just be a part of it, lean in, and know we are all in this together, and we have to stick together to make it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Dr. AdamsKellum and Janie, thank you guys so much for taking the time. And you're both very much on the front lines and doing such incredibly critical work. And I know we're putting up this slide that has your contact information, which is really generous of you. So for the insights and for the expertise and for the time, thank you. On behalf of Dean Hunt and UCLA and the California Policy Lab, thank you to everyone very much for attending today. I hope you found it to be a valuable discussion. And we're looking forward to seeing you back here very soon.